as you can see, the weather was pretty cold that day, rainy. We actually ran into some snow when we got up a little higher, so we decided to brave it anyway and go adventure around some new country. Here is the New York mine. We stumbled across it. Now this mine had about 900 feet worth of workings through about 5 different adits. It looked like most of the work was done between 1937 and 1941. Didn't look like a real rich mine. It said the mill head results were about $8 per ton, and that was at $35 an ounce, so less than a half ounce per ton. Here's an old building that, about the only building left on this side of the highway. On the other side, it looked like there was a couple other buildings. We didn't get over there to them. With not much to see with all the collapsed adits, we decided to hit the road. Now this is the Blue Ribbon Mine, or what's left of it. A little research after I got back. This had about 2,000 feet of workings through 2 different adits and a small shaft that was underground at this adit we're at now. Both adits were collapsed, but you can see the tailing pile on this one was a pretty decent sized tailing pile. I did find a little ore sample, which you'll see here in a minute, laying down over the side of the hill here. I haven't crushed it up yet, but it was kind of interesting looking. By this time everybody was starting to get fairly cold, and decided it was a good time to take a break and wander around this mine and look at these old buildings that are left, or what little is left of them. It's still pretty interesting. These buildings look like they were, built with just material that they found on site. This wasn't the main living facility, I don't think. I think the main one was down below. I just happened to walk out that door right there and was kind of trying to eye the tailing pile a little better, and noticed there's another building further down the hillside, and that I didn't have any clue that was down there. You can't see it from the upper tailing pile. You can just barely see it there down through the trees. So I wandered down there, and here's a look up the main tailing pile that we were just standing on. And here's that larger cabin. I think that's the main cabin that they stayed in here. And this is the lower adit. The tailing pile in it wasn't nearly as large as the upper one. And the production records for this mine just say small production, so really don't know what this mine produced. And you can see the collapsed adit there. And the square sets, you can see those were just round timbers that they tried to notch out for square sets. And here's another look at that lower tailing pile. Like I said, it's not nearly as large as the upper one. And this cabin was pretty interesting. I wish I could have seen this when it was the roof was still standing. You can see the old shelving and everything on the wall there, and they had a storage room here, and that thing was completely full of pack rats. I missed it on camera, but there was 2 of them running around in there. And this thing was a mixture of logs and milled boards. It was pretty interesting to look at. And that wood that's stacked up there, that was their firewood stack. Surprisingly, most of that wood was still in pretty good shape. It's Western Larch or Tamarack, and a few pieces were rotten, but boy, most of them I picked up, they were just still real pitchy and in really good shape. And those trees you see leaning up there, I was trying to figure out if somebody had leaned those up there to try and hold the building up, but I think they just fell against the building and made it look that way. From up above, it definitely looks like somebody propped the building up with them, but I'm pretty sure they just fell against the building. So after that, we decided to hike on up out of there. And here's a look at that chunk of ore I found. Now this is brecciated argillite, and I haven't crushed this thing up yet, but it looks pretty good. Then it was time to build a fire, get everybody warm again, have a little lunch, and just kind of relax. While we were sitting there, it actually snowed on us some. Now we're inside the mill at Cabell City, and it's pretty much a complete mill. This looks to me like an early version of a Wilfley table, more or less a shaker table, and I'd never seen one built quite like this thing was. And the whole mechanism's still there, and it was really interesting to see that still set up. It was fed by a ball mill, which we're walking up to now. Obviously, this mine has been operated in more recent years, but most of the equipment in there is still from probably before the 1940s. Here we're looking at that ball mill. Most everything in here was powered by belts. And in a minute, we'll look at one of the gearboxes up above. Now, this was quite a setup. And surprisingly, pretty much everything is still there besides the power plant that powered it. It got hauled off just a few weeks ago. Mainly to preserve it. Stuff was starting to get stolen out of this site. So they went and rescued a few items out of here that they figured were going to get stolen here fairly quickly. Here we're looking at the output side of that ball mill. And it has more or less a little trommel set up on the back side of it to sort the material. The really fine material went ahead and fed right down into that table. The coarser stuff was fed back into the mill. It flowed down this little trough you see right here into that contraption, which pulled it back up and fed it back through the mill again. Closer look at that little trommel. It has really fine mesh screen on it, and whatever fell through that screen fed directly into that table. So evidently they were looking for pretty much free milling gold out of this mine. What fed this mine was right above it. There was about 3 adits, which I didn't get on camera. I'm going to have to go back and get those. I think they're all collapsed, but this was a fairly small mine. And here you can see that that tray that feeds the coarser material back down into this, which then pulled the material back up this chute and dumped it back in. And then it had an output there for the fine material to feed on down into the table below. And this slusher setup would pull that coarser material back up towards the top of the ball mill and feed it back into the system. You can see here it dumped it into this little tray and down it went. There's a piece missing here, you'll see in a second, that would have fed that back into the ball mill, but you get the general idea. And there's the input to the ball mill. And again, there's a piece missing right here that would have fed up to the chute coming out of their ore bin. Right here's the bottom of the ore bin. And there would have been a chute heading down to feed material into that ball mill continually. Again, everything was belt driven in here. And here's a look at part of that belt drive. It looks like a transmission out of a truck. So they could evidently change the speed at which the belts were operating. This is actually up above the ball mill. I used the selfie stick and extended the camera way up so you could see what was up there. Now, Cabell City really wasn't a true city in the sense of the word. It was formed by Fred and John Cobell back around the 1880s. They owned the LaBellevue mine, which is up this canyon a little further. And this was kind of their mill site, and a little small, I guess, kind of community formed up around it, but they didn't have a post office or anything. And it was more or less just a mill and a boarding house. And what you see here is pretty much all that remains, along with a small graveyard up there. You can see back in there what they used for an ore bin. It's an old fuel tank that they fed the material into. Obviously, this was later than the 1880s that this part was done. And that ore bin was fed by that small conveyor they had set up there. It always cracks me up on these old mills how they installed the windows up there. Just kind of whatever angle looked good, that's the way they put them in. You can look back on many old pictures of mills, and they put them in at all kinds of different angles. Now, I'm not sure what time period this mill, the way it's currently set up, was installed. I'm guessing most of it was installed in the 30s, maybe early 40s. And then somebody come in later, and it looks like they've done some mining. I'm guessing probably up into the 70s, from the look of the electrical boxes. Some of them are fairly new. Some of them are pretty old, but again, some of them are fairly new. So I'm thinking somebody came in much later and did some work here. I'm pretty sure right there would have been a small jaw crusher set up, or some kind of pre-crusher before it went into that ball mill. I'm not sure. There's the ore bin up above. And I'm pretty sure there was a pre-crusher here. It might have been a cone crusher or a jaw crusher. Somebody's taken it, obviously. But there would have been some crusher before it went into that ball mill. Here's a closer look at that ore bin and that cable that's holding it there in place. That was a really weird stranded cable. I don't really even know how to explain it. Just the stranding on it was really strange. Almost looked like copper stranded cable. And here's looking down at the mill from the top of the ore bin. Had a small grizzly on it. Now you're about to see where there was a vehicle sitting, and it's been rescued a few weeks ago. It was sitting right here, and I think it was this vehicle right here. They rescued a couple of them out of there. This one, I guess the body or the engine on it's got a Studebaker number on it, but it had an international cab on it, and somebody's went in there and stolen the cab, and so they decided they better get the rest of this out of there before it all walks away. And hopefully they're able to recover that cab and get it back on the truck, and maybe use it during the local parades and such. And they also recovered this old ore cart, or part of the ore cart. Now, I had no idea Alice Chalmers made ore carts, but evidently they did. This is a pretty good example of one. It's too bad the wheels aren't on it. But this old truck here was probably the most interesting thing they got out of there. Hand crank dump on it, and you can tell this thing was just put together with whatever they had on hand. And I think it's pretty obvious that's not the original bed on the truck. They just put that smaller bed on there so they could put this hand crank winch on there for a dump bed. It's pretty ingenious, really. Must have been a lot of work to crank that thing to dump that if they had a full load of ore on it. The inside, the rats and mice have got to it pretty good. But, overall, for, I don't know how long this thing's been sitting there. It's really not in that bad a shape. And talking to the guys that brought this out, they hope to restore this to at least some degree and use it as a local display, maybe put it in the local museum, do something with it. Otherwise, I think all the parts would have been swiped off of it, and eventually all this would be packed away. Now, I'm not sure what year this truck is. It's an old International. Probably some of the viewers out there have a better idea what year this truck was. I'm not real skookum on these old trucks and cars, so I'm sure somebody out there has a lot better idea on this truck. But this thing was super interesting to look at, and I'm really glad that they pulled this out, and I sure hope it gets on display somewhere local where everybody can see this thing and admire it. I mean, that just the work that went into this thing's pretty amazing. It's really too bad this was never on film of how they actually used this thing. You know, I'm sure they ran up to the mine and brought the ore down and dumped it in that ore bin, but it would have been really neat to see it in operation. And here's some of the outbuildings that we ran into while we were there. There's several of them standing still. You know, I think a lot of stuff has been stolen out of here already, but it still had some stuff left in there. This one had some herbicide, and at least that's what the barrel said, and some other little containers. Obviously, some of those aren't real old. And here's the main living quarters. We never did get up into the upstairs of that stairway had collapsed, and there's no other way up into there that I could find. By the time we were done, we were cold and wet, so I didn't take the time to go up there and look around. And here's coming into the front of this building. Somebody's busted the front door in. Or what? I guess there was a door there of some kind, but they've busted it in. And, you know, I was kind of surprised to see furniture still left in here. That really kind of surprised the heck out of me. And several of the windows are still in place. It was, the pack rats have really done a number on this building. And those doorways, I'm, about 5'11", and I had to duck pretty good to get through those doors. Those guys that built that must have been fairly short. And every one of the doorways were the same way. A couple of them, if you were 5'5", you'd hit your head on them pretty easy. You know, the wood stove, people have stolen most of the plates off of it, and surprised the main part of the stove was actually still there. And they had a gas stove in there. And this old fridge, I was kind of scared to open it. I went ahead and opened it. But it was a gas-operated fridge. At first, I wasn't sure whether it was gas or electric, but it was a gas fridge. And nothing in it, but it's sure a neat old fridge. I have no idea the vintage of this fridge, you know. If I had to guess, I'd say 40s or 50s. And the kids, they were astounded that there was a toilet still left here. You can see the twerps there. They're 5, and you can see that doorway compared to them, how tall that doorway actually is. And I believe this is one of the bedrooms. And it still had a hanger in there from, I think it was a dry cleaning company. And there was this old box in there. There was really nothing in it. There's some paper in there that I'm super surprised that the pack rats hadn't totally chewed that up yet, but it was still in pretty good shape. Obviously, they had electricity here, but I'm not sure if it came from a power line or they had a generator on site. And here's that clothes hanger. Still has the numbers on it. I don't know if that company's still in business or not, but it was kind of interesting. And we made our way back out of that back bedroom, toured around the kitchen a little bit more, and checked out what appliances were left. I think that was their hot water heater back there in the corner. I'm not sure what produced the heat for it, but it was pretty interesting to look at. And here we're coming back into that back bedroom. And in this back part, the floor was really squishy back here. Not much left holding that floor together. And you know, for the day, I think this probably would have been a pretty nice building. It actually has a little bit of insulation in the walls, it looked like, so actually staying there wouldn't have been too awful bad, at least compared to a lot of the mines I've seen. And we made it out without getting bitten by any pack rats or anything. Made sure the kids washed their hands about 10 times after being in there, though. And here's a look at, standing back a little bit from that building, what it really looks like. The trees have grown up so much around it, it's really hard to get a good view of any of these buildings besides the mill. And now I think they got this under some surveillance, so hopefully they can curtail any more theft out of here. I was actually pretty hesitant to even make this video. Sometimes it's not great to bring attention to a spot like this and give looters any ideas, but now that they've got some surveillance up around this, I don't think it'll be too bad. If somebody walks off with stuff, hopefully they can catch them. As you can see, it started to snow on us here a little bit. And real close by is a small graveyard with 3 graves in it. One is Fred Cabell, his wife Johanna, and their 8-year-old daughter. So there's an interesting story that goes along with this cemetery. Fred Cabell went to college in Germany where he met his future wife. But it was 20 years before he could bring her over to the United States. So around 1880, he was finally able to afford to bring her into the United States. And they married, of course, and had one child. That child, when she was 8 years old, it sounds like they either gave her the wrong medicine or the wrong dose of the medicine, and she passed away from it. And during this time period, they lived most of their married life there at that mine, or at Cabell City. And during that time period, the story goes she didn't have any contact with any other females that whole time span. It wasn't until 1914 when her husband died and she moved to Baker City till she had contact with other women. And in 1914, evidently he knew he was going to pass away. He went and had a coffin made, and he died actually in Sumter and was buried right next to his daughter there at Cabell City. His wife lived till 1923 in Baker City, where she passed away. After she passed away in 1923, they had to wait for the roads to clear that spring in order to get her up to the graveyard to bury her with the rest of her family. I don't know, I just found that story pretty interesting and a little bit sad at the same time, but it's still really interesting. I hope you enjoyed today's video. That area was new to me. I've driven through there a few times hunting and stuff, but not really explored many of the mines in that little particular area. So there's a lot more to explore, and we were hoping to get some more exploration done that day, but the weather got everybody cold, and it was just time to head back to the rig after that visit there at Cabell City. So we're going to go back and do a lot more exploring in that area, so stay tuned for that. And as always, thanks for subscribing, taking the time to watch these. Remember to hit the little bell so you get notified when a new video pops up. And we'll see you guys on the next video.